Dead silence filled the cathedral, the cruelty of his words still bouncing off the stained glass windows. He hadn't just left her at the altar. He had meticulously orchestrated this moment to destroy her family's name in front of 500 elite guests. Just as the tears welled and the vicious whispers began, she felt as though her life were finished. Suddenly a man emerged from the front pew, not just any man, but the Crown Prince himself. Audrey Kingsley was the quintessential darling of London's high society. Born into a lineage that traced its roots back to the aristocrats of the 19th century, her family possessed old money, immense cultural influence, and a reputation that demanded respect. Her father, Richard Kingsley, was a renowned philanthropist and a former diplomat, while her mother, Beatrice, sat on the board of every major arts institution in Europe. Audrey herself was no mere socialite. At 26, she was a respected art historian who had spent the last 3 years curating exhibits for the National Gallery. To the outside world, her life was a flawless tapestry, and the crowning jewel of this perfect existence was supposed to be her marriage to Harrison Sinclair. Harrison was a force of nature. A self-made billionaire in the tech sector, he had exploded onto the European financial scene with an aggressive charm and a ruthless business acumen. He was handsome, relentlessly ambitious, and lacked the quiet subtlety of old money, which at first Audrey found incredibly refreshing. Where the men of her social circle were painfully reserved, Harrison was bold. He pursued her with an intensity that left her breathless, renting out entire restaurants for their dates and flying her to Lake Como on a whim. Their engagement was the event of the decade. The society pages dubbed it the ultimate union, the merging of unassailable aristocratic heritage with the limitless power of New World wealth. The wedding was set to take place at St. Jude's Cathedral in the heart of London, followed by a reception at the historic Savoy Hotel. But behind the velvet ropes and the flashing cameras, subtle, insidious cracks were already beginning to form. In the final weeks leading up to the wedding, Harrison's behavior shifted. The attentive, affectionate man Audrey had fallen in love with became cold and distant. He was frequently stuck in board meetings until 3 in the morning. When they did attend social functions together, he would often leave her side to hold hushed, intense conversations with his legal team, or curiously with Audrey's closest confidant, Clara Hastings. Clara was a childhood friend, a woman whose family had recently fallen on hard financial times. Audrey, fiercely loyal, had taken Clara under her wing, ensuring she was still invited to all the elite galas, and even appointing her as the maid of honor. Audrey had brushed off their private conversations, assuming Harrison was secretly planning a wedding surprise or asking Clara for advice on a wedding gift. The rehearsal dinner at the Dorchester was the first undeniable red flag. The atmosphere was stifling. Harrison arrived late, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding Audrey's entirely. During the toast, rather than delivering the customary speech declaring his love for his bride-to-be, he stood up, raised his glass of vintage champagne, and said, "To the future. May everyone finally get exactly what they deserve." It was a chilling sentiment, devoid of warmth. Audrey's mother, Beatrice, leaned over and whispered, "Darling, is everything quite all right with him? He looks as though he's preparing for a hostile takeover, not a wedding." "He's just stressed, Mother," Audrey had replied, forcing a smile to mask the sudden icy dread pooling in her stomach. "The market has been volatile." She had no idea that the hostile takeover he was preparing for was the systematic destruction of her own life. Saturday, the 12th of June, dawned with a brilliant, mocking sunshine. The bells of St. Jude's Cathedral rang out across London, signaling the arrival of the city's most anticipated wedding. The guest list read like a summit of global power: politicians, tech magnates, old money aristocrats, and even foreign royalty. Sitting quietly in the VIP section, attempting to avoid the press, was Crown Prince Arthas of Caledonia. Known for his devastating good looks, sharp intellect, and notoriously private life, Arthas was an old acquaintance of Audrey's family, though they hadn't spoken intimately in years. Audrey stood in the vestibule adjusting the intricate lace sleeves of her bespoke Dior gown. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. When the massive oak doors swung open and the first notes of the organ swelled, she took a deep breath, linked her arm through her father's, and began the long walk down the aisle. The cathedral was a sea of turning heads, collective gasps, and the soft clicking of discreet cameras. It was perfect, a fairy tale. But as Audrey's eyes locked onto the altar, the fairy tale violently shattered. Harrison was standing there looking immaculate in his tailored tuxedo. However, his expression was not one of awe or overwhelming love. His eyes were hard, his lips curled into a smirk that radiated pure malice. Beside him, his groomsmen looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting their weight and staring at the floor. Audrey's smile faltered, but momentum carried her forward. Richard Kingsley handed his daughter over to Harrison, offering the younger man a firm nod. Harrison didn't return it. The Archbishop of Canterbury began the solemn ceremony, his resonant voice filling the cavernous space. Audrey's hands were trembling as she held her bouquet of white peonies. Harrison didn't reach out to steady her. He stood like a statue. Then came the moment that would define the rest of their lives. Should anyone present know of any reason that this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. It was a formality, a traditional relic that was never ever utilized in modern society weddings. The Archbishop barely paused, ready to move on to the vows. "I have a reason." The voice echoed like a gunshot. 500 guests froze simultaneously. The Archbishop blinked, taken aback. Audrey whipped her head around, expecting to see a deranged ex-girlfriend or a disgruntled business partner in the back of the church. But the voice hadn't come from the pews. It had come from the man standing inches away from her. Harrison stepped away from the altar, turning his back on the Archbishop to face the stunned crowd. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek microphone, something he had clearly prepared in advance. "Harrison, what are you doing?" Audrey whispered, the blood draining from her face. He ignored her, his eyes scanning the elite audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison's voice boomed through the cathedral's speaker system, which he had evidently bribed the sound engineers to hijack. "You are all here today to witness the merger of two great dynasties, the Sinclair fortune and the esteemed, untouchable Kingsley legacy." He sneered the word legacy. "But I believe in transparency, and the truth is, there is no Kingsley legacy anymore." "Is there, Richard?" Harrison pointed a sharp finger directly at Audrey's father in the front row. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Richard Kingsley stood up, his face purple with rage and confusion. "Sinclair? Have you lost your mind? Stop this madness immediately. Sit down, Richard." Harrison barked the sudden aggression, startling the guests. "Or should I project the financial documents onto the cathedral walls? The bad investments, the offshore accounts that got frozen last month, the crippling, insurmountable debt." Audrey felt her knees buckle. She looked at her father, expecting him to shout a denial to call security. But Richard had slumped back into his pew, his face buried in his hands. Beatrice was sobbing into her silk handkerchief. It was true. Audrey didn't love me. Harrison continued, his voice dripping with venom. He turned to look at her, his eyes alight with cruel triumph. "She loved my bank accounts. Her family targeted me to bail them out of bankruptcy. They thought they could secure their precious social standing by whoring out their only daughter to the highest bidder." "No!" Audrey cried out, tears spilling over her mascara, ruining her flawless makeup. "Harrison, that's a lie. I didn't know I loved you. Save the performance, Audrey." He scoffed the microphone, catching his mocking laughter. "I'm not a charity, and I'm certainly not a fool. I canceled the wire transfers to your father's shell companies this morning. You're ruined, penniless, a pathetic punchline to a joke you didn't even realize you were the punchline of." The silence in the cathedral was suffocating. The cruelty of the ambush was so absolute, so meticulously planned, that no one knew how to react. And as for love, Harrison said, his tone softening slightly as he looked toward the bridal party, "I did find it, just not with you." From the line of bridesmaids, a figure stepped forward. It was Clara Hastings, Audrey's best friend. Clara, who had dried Audrey's tears, helped pick out the wedding dress and toasted to their eternal happiness just last night. Clara walked calmly across the marble floor and stood next to Harrison. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Clara and I have been together for 6 months," Harrison announced. "She showed me what real loyalty looks like. She warned me about your family's plot, so consider this wedding canceled." Harrison tossed the microphone onto the stone floor. The screech of feedback caused several guests to cover their ears. He took Clara's hand, and together they began to walk down the aisle past the horrified, staring faces of London's elite. Audrey stood abandoned at the altar. Her world had just been violently dismantled in less than 5 minutes. She was publicly branded a gold digger, her family's financial ruin was broadcast to the world, and her best friend had stolen her fiancé. The physical pain in her chest was so severe she thought she might be having a heart attack. She looked out at the sea of faces, people she had known her entire life, and saw only pity shock and worst of all judgment. She needed to run. She needed to hide. But her legs refused to move. She was trapped in the wreckage of her own life, a spectacle for the vultures. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's slammed shut behind Harrison and Clara, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. Chaos immediately erupted in the pews. Whispers turned into loud murmurs, and several journalists who had snuck into the back rows were already furiously typing on their phones, the scandal of the century practically writing itself. Audrey swayed, her vision blurring. She took a frail step backward, gripping the edge of the marble altar to keep from collapsing. The archbishop reached out a tentative hand, whispering, "My dear child." But she couldn't hear him over the roaring in her ears. "I have to leave," she thought desperately. "I have to get out." She picked up the heavy, voluminous skirts of her Dior gown, ready to flee through a side door to escape into the rain and disappear forever. "Hold on!" The voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it possessed a natural commanding baritone that effortlessly cut through the rising clamor of the cathedral. The murmuring stopped instantly. 500 heads snapped toward the VIP section on the right side of the aisle. Rising from the front pew was Crown Prince Arthas. Arthas was a man who rarely made public spectacles. At 32, he was the heir to the Caledonian throne, a modern, fiercely wealthy European principality. He was widely considered the most eligible bachelor in the world, renowned for his stoic demeanor, his military background, and his unwavering dedication to his country. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal gray morning suit, looking every inch the future king. Arthas stepped out of the pew. The crowd parted instinctively, treating him with the ingrained deference his title demanded. He didn't look at the gossiping socialites or the frantic press. His intense, piercing blue eyes were locked solely on Audrey. He walked slowly, deliberately up the steps to the altar. His presence was magnetic, a calm anchor in the center of a raging storm. Audrey stared at him, her chest heaving, tears tracking through her ruined makeup. "Arthas," she whispered, her voice cracking. What are you doing?" They had met several times over the years. Her father had once negotiated a trade agreement with Arthas's uncle, and Arthas had attended a few galas Audrey had curated. There had always been a quiet, lingering tension between them, a mutual, unspoken admiration, but he was a royal bound by duty, and she had been swept up in the whirlwind of Harrison Sinclair. Arthas stopped directly in front of her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pristine white linen handkerchief. Gently, with a tenderness that shocked the onlookers, he reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek. "You are shaking, Audrey," he said softly, though the acoustics of the stone church carried his voice to the first few rows. He ruined me." Audrey choked out the humiliation, finally breaking her composure. "It's all gone. My life is gone. But Harrison Sinclair is a coward with a bank account and a fragile ego." Arthas replied, his voice hardening with disdain. "He is entirely beneath you. And as for your family's circumstances, wealth is transient. Class, grace, and honor are not. You possess those in abundance. He possesses none." The cathedral was so silent you could hear a pin drop. The Crown Prince of Caledonia was openly insulting a billionaire and defending a disgraced socialite. The social hierarchy of the room was actively rewriting itself before their eyes. Arthas turned his head slightly, addressing the archbishop, but speaking loudly enough for the entire congregation to hear. "Your Grace, I believe you asked if anyone had a reason why this wedding should not proceed." The archbishop, sweating under his heavy robes, nodded nervously. "Yes, Your Highness." Arthas turned back to Audrey. The cold, stoic, royal facade he wore for the cameras melted away, replaced by something fiercely protective and surprisingly warm. "I have a reason," Arthas said, his eyes never leaving hers. "The reason this wedding cannot proceed is because Audrey Kingsley belongs with someone who understands her worth. Someone who doesn't need to tear her down to make himself feel powerful." Audrey's breath hitched. "Arthas, please. The press is here. You're causing a scandal." "Let them write whatever they want." Arthas said, a reckless, brilliant smile touching the corners of his lips. It was the first time Audrey had ever seen him smile like that. "I have spent my entire life doing exactly what is expected of me. I've married my duty. I've hidden my feelings because the timing was never right or the politics were too complicated. But watching that man try to break you, I am done waiting." He took a step closer, invading her personal space, enveloping her in the scent of cedar and expensive cologne. "Audrey," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, "walk out of these doors with me." She stared at him, bewildered. "What?" "Leave with me, right now. My car's waiting at the side entrance. Let me take you away from this. Let me show you how a real man treats the woman he intends to make his queen." A gasp ripped through the front rows. Did the Crown Prince just essentially propose, "I have nothing, Arthas"? Audrey whispered, desperately wanting to protect him from her own radioactive fallout. "Harrison wasn't lying. My family is penniless. I am a scandal." "You are Audrey Kingsley," Arthas corrected, fiercely grabbing both of her trembling hands in his. "You are brilliant, you are resilient, and you are the only woman I have ever truly wanted. Let Sinclair keep his tech money and his treacherous mistress. Let him wallow in the mud. You are meant for the palace." He didn't wait for her to overthink it. He didn't give the gossips time to intervene. Arthas shifted his grip, lacing his fingers tightly through hers. He turned to the crowd, his regal authority radiating through the room. "Anyone who speaks a word against the Kingsley family from this day forward answers directly to the Crown of Caledonia." Arthas announced, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying authority. "Consider yourselves warned." With that, Crown Prince Arthas gently tugged her hand. Audrey didn't resist. She let go of the wilting bouquet of peonies, letting it drop to the marble floor where Harrison had stood just moments before. Holding tight to the prince's hand, Audrey walked back down the aisle. But she was no longer a disgraced, abandoned bride. She was walking tall, escorted by royalty, leaving the whispering ruins of her old life behind, and stepping into a future no one could have ever predicted. The heavy brass-studded side doors of St. Jude's Cathedral swung open, and the humid, overcast London air hit Audrey like a physical blow. The transition from the suffocating silent judgment of the cathedral to the chaotic frenzy outside was instantaneous. Word had already leaked. A swarm of paparazzi, tipped off by guests texting frantically from the pews, had converged on the church steps. Camera flashes exploded like strobe lights, blinding Audrey. Reporters shouted her name, their voices a cacophony of invasive questions. "Audrey, is it true your family is bankrupt? Where is Harrison? Your Highness, Prince Arthas, are you taking her away?" Audrey flinched instinctively, raising a hand to shield her tear-stained face. But Arthas didn't hesitate. He wrapped a strong protective arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. His security detail, 4 towering men in dark suits, materialized out of nowhere, forming an impenetrable human wall around them. "Keep your eyes on the car, Audrey." Arthas murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble near her ear. "Do not look at them. Do not give them a photograph of you crying." She nodded, drawing strength from his unyielding composure. They moved swiftly down the stone steps and ducked into the cavernous tinted interior of a waiting armored Rolls-Royce. The heavy doors slammed shut instantly, cutting off the roar of the press. As the car accelerated away from Mayfair, Audrey collapsed back against the plush leather seats. The adrenaline that had kept her standing at the altar suddenly evaporated, leaving her hollow and violently trembling. She looked down at her bespoke Dior gown, a garment that had taken 6 months and hundreds of hours to construct, now a tragic costume of her own humiliation. Arthas reached into a hidden compartment and poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, pressing it into her hands. "Drink. It's Macallan. It will steady your nerves." She took a shaky sip, the burn of the scotch grounding her. She looked at the man sitting beside her. Crown Prince Arthas of Caledonia. He was looking out the window, his jaw clenched, radiating a quiet, dangerous fury. "Arthas," she whispered, her voice raw. "Why did you do that? You just inserted the Caledonian royal family into the ugliest society scandal of the decade. Your PR team is going to have a heart attack." Arthas turned to her, his piercing blue eyes softening. "My PR team works for me, Audrey, and I do not care about society scandals. I care about you." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Harrison Sinclair did not just cancel a wedding today. This was a calculated, synchronized corporate assassination. For the past 3 months, my intelligence division has been investigating Sinclair." Audrey blinked, the scotch burning in her chest. "Investigating him? Why?" His tech conglomerate Zenith Solutions submitted a massive bid for a Caledonian government cybersecurity contract. As standard protocol, we look into the private lives and financial dealings of our potential contractors. What my team uncovered was disturbing. Arthas pulled a slim, encrypted tablet from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "Harrison didn't just discover your family's financial troubles. He orchestrated them." Audrey stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The documents displayed were complex financial logs, wire transfers, and shell company registries. "Your father Richard was a brilliant diplomat, but a terrible investor," Arthas explained gently. 2 years ago, he took out a substantial high-interest loan to cover a series of bad real estate investments in Dubai. The lender was an anonymous private equity firm. That firm, Audrey, is a subsidiary entirely controlled by Harrison Sinclair. The puzzle pieces began to lock together with sickening clarity. "So Harrison bought your father's debt," Arthas finished. "He deliberately suffocated your family's assets, freezing accounts, and manipulating the market to push your estate to the brink of foreclosure. Then he swooped in as the charming billionaire savior, offering to marry you to merge the families, which bought him absolute trust. He used that trust to gain power of attorney over your father's remaining holding companies. And Clara..." Audrey asked, the betrayal of her best friend still an open, bleeding wound. "Clara Hastings was his inside man, or rather, his inside woman." Arthas said, his tone laced with disgust. "She needed money to save her own family's fading social status. Harrison paid her off. She fed him the internal passwords, your father's private schedules, and the emotional leverage he needed to manipulate you." Audrey covered her mouth, a sob tearing at her throat. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a heist. Harrison hadn't just broken her heart. He had dismantled her family's century-old legacy for sport and profit. He wanted the Kingsley estate in the country. Audrey realized, her eyes wide with horror. The land rights. It sits on one of the largest untapped lithium deposits in the UK. My father refused to mine it for environmental reasons. Exactly. Arthas nodded. By publicly humiliating you and destroying your father's reputation today, he ensured the Kingsley name is toxic. The banks will call in the remaining loans by Monday morning. Your family will be forced to liquidate the estate for pennies on the pound, and Zenith Solutions will buy it through a proxy. Audrey felt a cold, hard knot of pure rage replace the sorrow in her stomach. The tears stopped. She handed the tablet back to Arthas, her back straightening. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Arthas allowed a small, proud smile to touch his lips. "We are going to the private terminal at Heathrow. My jet is waiting. You are coming to Caledonia. And then, Audrey, we are going to war." The following 48 hours were a masterclass in media manipulation and shifting power dynamics. In London, Harrison Sinclair's grand victory lap hit a concrete wall. He had planned for the Sunday editions of the Financial Times and the Times to run front-page features on the spectacular collapse of the Kingsley dynasty, cementing his image as the ruthless, untouchable victor who dodged a bullet. Instead, the global news cycle was utterly hijacked by a single-photograph Crown Prince Arthas of Caledonia, looking like a furious protective god leading a devastated but stunningly beautiful Audrey Kingsley out of St. Jude's Cathedral. The headlines shifted from financial ruin to modern fairy tale. Royal Rescue Crown Prince steals the bride from ruin to royalty. Audrey Kingsley's shocking escape, the billionaire's blunder. How Sinclair lost his bride to a future king. Inside his glass-walled penthouse in Canary Wharf, Harrison hurled a crystal whiskey tumbler against a flat-screen television, shattering the glass. Clara, lounging on a velvet sofa in a silk robe, flinched. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Harrison roared, pacing the floor. "She was supposed to crawl out the back door in shame. How the hell did Arthas of Caledonia get involved?" "It doesn't matter, Harrison," Clara said, trying to soothe him, though a flicker of unease danced in her eyes. "Her family is still broke. We still have the power of attorney. By tomorrow we seize the country estate." "You don't understand royal immunity and diplomatic interference, Clara," he snapped. "If Arthas decides to personally underwrite the Kingsley debt, my entire acquisition falls apart. Get Dominic Fry on the phone. We need a smear campaign on Audrey now. Tell the press she was having an affair with the prince behind my back. Paint me as the victim. Halfwart." Hundreds of miles away in the breathtaking palace of St. Helier, overlooking the turquoise waters of the Caledonian coast, Audrey was not acting like a victim. She stood in the center of the grand library, dressed no longer in ruined bridal lace, but in a sharp, tailored navy pantsuit provided by the royal dressmakers. Across the mahogany table sat Arthas, his top advisor, and shockingly Queen Genevieve of Caledonia herself. When Audrey had arrived, she had braced herself for the Queen's judgment. Genevieve was known as a fiercely traditional monarch. Instead, the Queen had taken one look at Audrey's exhausted, resolute face, ordered her a cup of strong Earl Grey tea, and said, "A man who attacks a woman's family to steal her land is a peasant, no matter how many billions he possesses. You have my full support, Miss Kingsley." Now they were plotting. Dominic Fry Sinclair's PR fixer has just leaked a story to the tabloids claiming you and Arthas have been secretly carrying on a romance for a year. The royal advisor noted, looking at his monitors. "They are trying to invalidate your victimhood." "Let them," Arthas said calmly, leaning back in his leather chair. He looked across the table at Audrey, his eyes intensely focused. "In fact, we are going to lean into it." Audrey looked up, surprised. "Lean into it, Arthas. I won't have your reputation tarnished by a fake scandal." "It's not entirely fake, Audrey," Arthas said quietly. The room seemed to fall away as he held her gaze. "I told you at the altar that I had waited too long. 4 years ago at the Red Cross Gala in Geneva, you wore a green silk dress. We spoke for exactly 22 minutes about Byzantine art. I've compared every woman I've met since then to you." Audrey's breath hitched. She remembered that night vividly. She had felt a profound electric connection with the prince, but Harrison had swooped into her life shortly after with overwhelming force, and Arthas had retreated to his royal duties. "I stayed away because you were engaged, and I respect boundaries." Arthas continued, his voice steady. "But Sinclair surrendered his right to you the moment he tried to destroy you. So we give the press exactly what they want, a royal romance. It makes you untouchable. It elevates your family's status, instantly freezing the banks from calling in the loans out of fear of offending the Caledonian crown. And while the banks are frozen..." Audrey's sharp mind caught up with the strategy, a fierce light igniting in her eyes. We strike back. Exactly. Arthas smiled a lethal, brilliant expression. My forensic accountants have finished decoding the encrypted files Clara Hastings stole from your father. We have undeniable proof of corporate espionage, illegal market manipulation, and insider trading by Zenith Solutions. But handing it to the police is too quiet. Sinclair humiliated you in front of 500 people. He deserves a public execution of his own. The Sovereign Ball is this Friday. Queen Genevieve chimed in a wicked glint in her regal eyes. It is the most exclusive event in Europe. The global financial regulators, European politicians, and the elite of London society will all be there. And Harrison Sinclair has been begging for an invitation for 3 years to legitimize his new money. Arthas added, "We will send him one, with a +1 for Miss Hastings." Audrey felt a thrill of terrifying anticipation race down her spine. The old Audrey, the naive, trusting socialite, had died on the altar of St. Jude's. The woman standing in the Royal Library was someone entirely new. "Send the invitation," Audrey said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Let them think they've won. Let them walk right into the trap." The Caledonian Sovereign Ball was a masterstroke of European opulence. The grand ballroom of the Palace of St. Helier was draped in gold leaf and illuminated by 20 massive baccarat crystal chandeliers. A full symphony orchestra played sweeping waltzes while the continent's most powerful figures mingled drinking vintage champagne. Harrison Sinclair and Clara Hastings arrived precisely at 9 o'clock. Harrison wore a smug, victorious grin, a bespoke velvet tuxedo hugging his frame. Clara clung to his arm, wearing a spectacular red Valentino gown, reveling in the jealous whispers of the aristocratic women who had once looked down on her. They had spent the entire week spinning the narrative in London. To their minds, Audrey was hiding in shame, protected only by a temporary royal whim. Harrison was confident that tonight he could corner Arthas, leverage his tech influence, and quietly squash any interference with the Kingsley estate acquisition. "Act like we own the place," Harrison murmured to Clara, grabbing a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. "These royals are nothing but relics. By Monday, I'll be the largest landholder in southern England." Suddenly, the orchestra stopped playing. The low murmur of the ballroom fell to a hushed silence as the royal chamberlain stepped to the top of the grand marble staircase. "Their Royal Highnesses Crown Prince Arthas of Caledonia and his honored guest, Lady Audrey Kingsley." Harrison's triumphant smile froze on his face. The massive mahogany doors at the top of the stairs opened. Arthas stepped out looking impossibly regal in his formal military dress uniform, adorned with sashes and medals. But it was the woman on his arm who stole the breath from the room. Audrey did not look like a broken, abandoned bride. She was a vision of absolute, untouchable power. She wore a custom-designed midnight blue gown by Alexander McQueen, covered in thousands of hand-sewn Swarovski crystals that caught the chandelier light like a starry night sky. The famous Caledonian sapphire tiara, a piece from Queen Genevieve's private collection, rested flawlessly in her dark hair. She was radiating confidence. She looked down at the crowd, her eyes scanning the room, until they locked directly onto Harrison and Clara. Audrey didn't flinch. She smiled. A cold, predatory smile. As Arthas and Audrey descended the stairs, the crowd parted for them, bowing and curtsying. The power dynamic in the room was palpable. Harrison felt a sudden icy knot form in his stomach. This wasn't a girl hiding from the press. This was a queen claiming her court. Arthas led Audrey directly across the ballroom, cutting a straight path toward Harrison and Clara. The surrounding guests, sensing the imminent drama, fell utterly silent, stepping back to form a wide circle around the four of them. "Sinclair," Arthas said, his voice carrying effortlessly in the quiet room. "I'm surprised you had the sheer audacity to show your face in my country." Harrison puffed out his chest, attempting to project dominance. "Your Highness, thank you for the invitation. I assumed it was an olive branch. After all, business is business. Audrey and I simply weren't a match." He looked at Audrey, his lip curling. "Though I see she's found a rather wealthy rebound." The collective gasp from the surrounding aristocrats was audible. Insulting the crown prince in his own palace was social suicide. Arthas didn't lose his temper. He simply stepped slightly to the side, allowing Audrey to take the lead. It wasn't an olive branch, Harrison. Audrey said, her voice smooth, calm, and devastatingly clear. It was a subpoena. Harrison frowned, glancing around. What are you talking about? You love transparency, don't you? Audrey asked, echoing the exact words he had used at the altar. You love standing in front of 500 people and revealing the truth. Audrey raised her hand, giving a subtle signal to the balcony above. Instantly, the massive digital screens that had been displaying the royal crests switched. Suddenly, high-definition images of documents flooded the screens large enough for the entire ballroom of politicians, bankers, and journalists to read. What is this? Clara whispered, her face draining of color. Those are wire transfers, Audrey announced smoothly. Specifically, the wire transfers Clara Hastings received from offshore accounts tied to Zenith Solutions, paying her to steal my father's corporate passwords and internal schedules over the last 6 months. Clara dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor. And those, Audrey continued, pointing to a second screen, are the internal memos from Zenith Solutions proving that Harrison Sinclair actively engaged in illegal market manipulation to devalue the Kingsley estate in order to bypass the UK Monopolies and Mergers Commission. Turn those off. Harrison barked, his face flushing crimson with panic. He lunged toward the AV booth, but 2 towering Caledonian royal guards stepped in his path, crossing their halberds. You hacked my servers, Harrison yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Arthas. This is illegal. This is inadmissible. We didn't hack anything, Arthas replied mildly, his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Hastings here was rather careless with her personal laptop on the St. Jude's Cathedral Wi-Fi during your wedding rehearsal. And as for admissibility, I think the authorities will disagree. From the edge of the crowd, 3 men and a woman in sharp, unassuming suits stepped forward. They flashed badges. Harrison Sinclair? The lead investigator said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. We are with Interpol's Financial Crimes Division, acting in coordination with Scotland Yard. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of corporate espionage, wire fraud, and illegal market manipulation. Harrison backed up, shaking his head, the illusion of his untouchable power shattering into dust. He looked at Clara, who was sobbing, already trying to distance herself from him. He looked at the elite crowd, who stared at him with absolute disgust. He was ruined. As the investigators moved in to place the handcuffs on Harrison, Audrey took a step forward. Harrison glared at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. You think you've won? Harrison spat as his hands were wrenched behind his back. You're nothing without him. You're just a bankrupt little girl playing dress-up. Audrey looked at the man she had almost tied her life to. She felt no anger anymore, only pity. I am Audrey Kingsley, she said softly, but with a spine of pure steel. My family's debt has been restructured, paid in full, by a coalition of European arts councils I secured myself this morning. You tried to bury me, Harrison, but you forgot one thing. She turned, placing her hand gently back onto the arm of the crown prince, who looked at her with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. I am the one who planted the garden, Audrey finished. As Harrison Sinclair was dragged out of the ballroom in handcuffs, his reputation and empire utterly destroyed, the orchestra struck up a triumphant waltz. Arthas pulled Audrey close, sweeping her onto the dance floor, leaving the shadows of her past behind them forever. The morning after the Caledonian Sovereign Ball, the global landscape had entirely shifted. When Audrey Kingsley woke in the plush, silk-draped guest suite of the Palace of St. Helier, she did not wake up as the humiliated, bankrupt socialite who had been left at the altar of St. Jude's just 8 days prior. She woke up as the undisputed victor of the most sensational society scandal in modern European history. The international press was in an absolute frenzy. The front pages of every major publication from the Times of London to Le Monde and the Wall Street Journal featured the same spectacular high-definition photograph. It was the image of Audrey draped in midnight blue Alexander McQueen and wearing the Caledonian sapphire tiara, staring down a handcuffed Harrison Sinclair as Interpol agents dragged him out of the royal ballroom. The narrative had completely flipped. The public who had initially viewed her with pity now revered her as a master strategist. She was dubbed the Iron Rose of Mayfair. But behind the sensational headlines, the real work of rebuilding her family's legacy was already underway. Downstairs in the royal breakfast room, Audrey found Crown Prince Arthas sitting at a long mahogany table, nursing a cup of black coffee and reviewing a stack of legal dossiers. "Good morning," Arthas said, his eyes lifting. The stoic, imposing mask he wore for the public instantly melted into a warm, genuine smile. "I see our PR strategy was effective. Zenith Solutions stock plummeted 34% at the opening bell in London this morning." Audrey took a seat across from him, a sense of profound peace washing over her. "And my father's estate, bursts fully secured," Arthas confirmed, sliding a thick leather-bound folder across the table. "The European Arts Coalition wired the funds to restructure the Kingsley debt at 4 in the morning. Your father's properties, including the country estate and the lithium deposits, are completely insulated from Zenith's liquidation. You are officially untouchable." Audrey rested her hand on the folder. The weight of the past year, the lies, the financial terror, the betrayal finally lifted off her shoulders. She looked at Arthas. He had risked his own flawless reputation, mobilized his country's intelligence agency, and leveraged his royal influence all to save a woman he hadn't spoken to in 4 years. "Arthas." Audrey began, her voice softening. "I don't know how I can ever repay you. This was supposed to be a strategic alliance to stop Harrison, but you went to war for me." Arthas stood up, walking slowly around the table until he was standing beside her chair. He reached down gently, taking her hand. "I didn't do this for strategy, Audrey," he said quietly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I did it because sitting in that cathedral, watching that coward try to break your spirit, I realized that I had made the greatest mistake of my life by letting you slip away 4 years ago in Geneva. I told you I wanted to show you how a real man treats the woman he intends to make his queen. That wasn't a line for the press." Audrey's breath caught in her throat. The fake romance they had fed to the media to protect her family's assets was blurring into a terrifying, beautiful reality. "My life is complicated, Arthas," she whispered, looking up into his piercing blue eyes. "I come with baggage, a massive public scandal. I am not the pristine, perfectly groomed royal bride the Caledonian Parliament expects." "I don't want a pristine bride," Arthas replied fiercely. "I want a partner. I want a woman who can stand in a room full of wolves and smile while she springs the trap. I want you." He knelt beside her chair, ignoring the formality of his royal station. "Come back to London with me tomorrow. We will face the fallout together. We will watch Zenith Solutions crumble. And when the dust settles, I want you to stay by my side, permanently." Audrey looked at the man who had pulled her from the wreckage of her own life. She felt a surge of overwhelming, undeniable love. There was no hesitation, no lingering trauma from Harrison's betrayal. Harrison had been an illusion. Arthas was absolute solid reality. "Yes." Audrey breathed, a radiant smile breaking across her face. "Yes, I will." When Arthas and Audrey returned to London, their arrival was treated with the pomp and circumstance of a state visit. They did not hide from the paparazzi. They walked hand in hand through Heathrow's VIP terminal, surrounded by the Caledonian Royal Guard. Audrey's return to her family's Mayfair townhouse was deeply emotional. Her father Richard, who had aged 10 years in the span of a week, wept when he embraced her. Her mother Beatrice held Arthas's hands and repeatedly thanked him for saving their daughter's life. But the victory tour was brief. The reality of the legal battlefield awaited them. Harrison Sinclair was out on a massive record-breaking bail, and he was not going down without a fight. The trial of Harrison Sinclair began in late October at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. It was dubbed the trial of the decade. The charges were staggering aggressive corporate espionage, massive wire fraud, illegal market manipulation, and grand extortion. Harrison had retained the services of one of the most ruthless defense barristers in the United Kingdom, a man named Simon Croft. Croft was notorious for finding loopholes in financial law and dismantling witnesses on the stand. Harrison's strategy was clear paint the entire situation as a bitter lover's quarrel blown out of proportion by a jealous royal. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity every single day. Audrey attended the proceedings sitting in the front gallery with Arthas by her side. She wore impeccably tailored suits, her expression composed, and unreadable, refusing to give Harrison the satisfaction of seeing her sweat. For the first 2 weeks, the Crown prosecutor, David Carmichael, systematically laid out the evidence. He presented the wire transfers Arthas's team had intercepted. He showed the court the internal memos proving Harrison had deliberately shorted the stock of Richard Kingsley's lending partners to force a margin call. But Harrison sat at the defense table with a smug, unnerving confidence. He frequently smirked at Audrey, whispering confidently to his barrister. On the 14th day of the trial, the reason for Harrison's confidence was revealed. Simon Croft called a surprise witness, bringing the courtroom to a dead halt. He produced a heavily redacted legal document that had not been in the initial discovery files. My Lord Accusapers, Croft addressed the presiding judge, Justice Reynolds. The prosecution claims that my client, Mr. Sinclair, engaged in fraudulent activities to illegally seize the Kingsley country estate. However, I hold in my hand a signed addendum dated 3 days before the canceled wedding. It is signed by Richard Kingsley himself. Audrey felt her stomach drop. She looked at her father, who was sitting next to her, his face pale with sudden confusion. "What is he talking about, Dad?" Audrey whispered urgently. "I don't know," Richard stammered. "I signed dozens of wedding-related asset transfers. Harrison's lawyers told me it was standard prenuptial protocol to merge the family trusts." Croft turned to the jury, his voice booming. "This addendum explicitly states that in the event of the wedding's cancellation for any reason, the deeds to the Kingsley estate would default to Zenith Solutions as collateral for the outstanding loans. Richard Kingsley signed it willingly. There was no fraud. It was a brutal but entirely legal business acquisition. Mr. Sinclair is innocent of extortion." The courtroom erupted into whispers. The press gallery furiously scribbled notes. If the document held up the core of the prosecution's case would collapse. Harrison had buried a poison pill in the prenuptial paperwork. Even though Audrey's new royal backing had paid off the cash debts, Harrison was arguing that the legal right to the land had already transferred to him the moment he canceled the wedding. Harrison turned around in his chair and looked directly at Audrey. He mouthed the words, "I win." Audrey's blood ran cold. She looked at Arthas, who was already texting his legal team. But before panic could fully set in, the massive oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The whispers died down as a woman walked down the center aisle. She was impeccably dressed, though her face was drawn and pale, devoid of the smug arrogance she had worn at the Sovereign Ball. It was Clara Hastings. Harrison's smirk instantly vanished. He grabbed his barrister's arm, his knuckles turning white. "What is she doing here?" "She's supposed to be in Dubai," he hissed audibly. Clara walked past the defense table without making eye contact and approached the prosecution's desk. Crown Prosecutor Carmichael stood up, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "My lord," Carmichael addressed the judge, "the Crown calls Clara Hastings to the stand." As Clara took the oath, the tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. Audrey watched her former best friend, the woman who had betrayed her for a payout, and a billionaire's false promises, take the seat. "Miss Hastings," Carmichael began, "you were intimately involved with the defendant Harrison Sinclair during the time he was engaged to Audrey Kingsley, correct?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly into the microphone. "And you are aware of the addendum the defense just presented to the court?" Clara took a deep breath. She looked out into the gallery, her eyes locking onto Audrey's. For the first time since the cathedral, Clara looked genuinely remorseful. The illusion of Harrison's protection had shattered when the Interpol agent stormed the ballroom, and Clara had realized she was nothing but an expendable pawn in his game. "Yes, I am aware of it," Clara said. Because I am the one who slipped it into the stack of Richard Kingsley's paperwork. The courtroom exploded. Justice Reynolds slammed his gavel repeatedly. Order, order in the court. Harrison shot out of his chair, his face purple with rage. She's lying. She cut a plea deal to save herself. Sit down, Mr. Sinclair, or I will have you removed and held in contempt. Justice Reynolds roared. Carmichael waited for the room to quiet before continuing. Miss Hastings, did Mr. Sinclair instruct you to hide this clause? Yes. Clara confessed, tears welling in her eyes. He knew Richard Kingsley trusted me. Harrison told me to place the addendum beneath a standard non-disclosure agreement regarding the wedding caterers. Richard never saw it. He never knew what he was signing. Harrison planned to cancel the wedding at the altar specifically to trigger that hidden clause and steal the land. The silence that followed was absolute. The final nail in the coffin had been hammered in, not by the Crown Prince, not by Audrey, but by the very woman Harrison had used to orchestrate his grand betrayal. Clara had struck an immunity deal with the Crown in exchange for her testimony. She provided audio recordings from her phone recordings of Harrison laughing about the forged addendum and detailing his exact plan to humiliate Audrey at St. Jude's to ensure the Kingsley name was too toxic to fight back. When the audio was played for the jury hearing, Harrison's cruel, calculating laughter echo through the hallowed halls of the Old Bailey. His fate was sealed. 2 days later, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, the tension broke like a fever. Guilty on all counts. Justice Reynolds did not hold back during the sentencing. Harrison Sinclair, the judge said, glaring down from the bench, you have weaponized the law, manipulated markets, and attempted to utterly destroy a family for sheer greed. Your actions display a staggering level of malice and a complete absence of morality. Harrison was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10. All his assets tied to Zenith Solutions were seized by the state to pay restitution, completely dismantling his billionaire empire. As the bailiffs clamped the heavy iron cuffs onto Harrison's wrists, he didn't look back at the gallery. He kept his head down, a broken, ruined man. Audrey stood up from her seat. She didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply turned her back on him, placed her hand in Arthas's, and walked out of the courtroom into the brilliant London sunshine, finally free. Exactly 14 months after the catastrophic events that shattered the quiet elegance of Mayfair, another wedding captivated the globe. But this time, the narrative was not one of a hostile corporate takeover masquerading as a romance, nor was it a stage set for a woman's public destruction. It was undeniably the wedding of the century, a celebration of victory, resilience, and a love forged in the crucible of absolute scandal. The Cathedral of St. Clement nestled in the historic heart of Caledonia's capital. St. Helier was a breathtaking masterpiece of centuries-old Gothic architecture. Outside its towering limestone walls, the city was electric. The streets were lined 10 deep with hundreds of thousands of cheering citizens, their faces painted in the national colors, waving a sea of blue and gold flags. The global television audience tuning in from every corner of the world was estimated to have surpassed 2 billion. The world that had once watched Audrey Kingsley break was now eagerly waiting to watch her reign. Deep inside the cathedral's private royal sanctuary, Audrey stood before a towering, centuries-old gilded mirror. The reflection staring back at her was not the terrified, trembling girl from St. Jude's. She was breathtaking, exuding a quiet, unshakable power. She had deliberately abandoned the restrictive heavy lace and suffocating corsetry of her previous bridal gown. Instead, she wore a bespoke creation of luminous pearl-white silk that flowed around her figure like liquid light. The gown featured a dramatic cathedral-length train, meticulously hand-embroidered with subtle silver thistles, the fierce, resilient national flower of Caledonia. Atop her dark hair rested a piece of monumental history, the diamond laurel wreath tiara, a personal wedding gift from Queen Genevieve. The ancient crown was a deliberate symbol of victory given only to those who had triumphed over adversity. The heavy oak door creaked open, and her father Richard stepped softly into the room. The past year had transformed him. The crushing weight of secret debt and impending ruin had been lifted, leaving behind a man who looked healthy, vibrant, and deeply humbled. He paused, his breath catching as he took in the sight of his daughter. "You look like a queen, Audrey," Richard whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. He walked over gently, taking her hands in his. "I look at you, and I am so incredibly proud of the woman you have become. I am so sorry for the part I played in leading you to the altar of a monster, but you saved us all." Audrey smiled warmly, squeezing his hands. "We saved each other, Dad. The past is gone. Today is about the future." "Are you ready?" he asked, offering his arm. "More than I have ever been." She replied, her voice steady and clear. They walked together to the vestibule. As the massive, intricately carved bronze doors swung open, a blinding wave of golden light from the cathedral's nave washed over them. The majestic, soaring swell of the Royal Symphony Orchestra filled the cavernous space, playing a bespoke composition written entirely for her entrance. As Audrey took her first step down the sweeping crimson carpet, she felt a profound sense of grounding. There was no icy terror, no impending sense of doom. She looked out over the sea of faces. The guest list was vastly different from the superficial social climbers of London. Sitting in the front pews were global dignitaries, heads of state, the fiercely loyal Arts Coalition that had saved her family's estate, and even David Carmichael, the Crown prosecutor who had helped put Harrison Sinclair behind bars. But Audrey's eyes quickly bypassed them all, locking onto the end of the aisle. Crown Prince Arthas stood at the altar, waiting for her. He was resplendent in his ceremonial military dress uniform, a sash of deepest crimson striking across his chest, adorned with the highest medals of the principality. He wasn't standing like a rigid, unfeeling statue. As he watched Audrey approach, his stoic public mask completely dissolved. A radiant, overwhelming smile broke across his handsome face. His piercing blue eyes shone with an intensity that made Audrey's breath catch. He looked at her not as a prize to be won, not as a strategic acquisition, but as his absolute, undeniable equal. Richard walked her up the final marble steps and placed his daughter's hand into Arthas's. The prince took her hand with a gentle, fiercely reassuring squeeze, pulling her just a fraction closer. The Archbishop of Caledonia stepped forward, his resonant voice echoing through the ancient stone cathedral. There were no dramatic pauses in this ceremony. There were no hidden microphones, no cruel ambushes waiting in the wings. There was only the solemn, beautiful truth of two people who had fought through the fire to find one another. "I, Arthas Edward, take you, Audrey Elizabeth, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Arthas said. His baritone voice carried effortlessly, ringing with absolute conviction. "To protect, to honor, and to stand beside in all of life's battles. I promise to be your shield, your partner, and your greatest champion. I loved you in the shadows, and I will love you in the light from this day until the end of my days." Audrey's hands were perfectly steady as she looked up at him, her heart overflowing. "I, Audrey Elizabeth, take you, Arthas Edward, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she replied, her voice ringing clear, strong, and deeply emotional. "To love, to cherish, and to build a future upon unshakable truth. I promise to stand by your side, to rule with unwavering compassion, and to choose you every single day for the rest of my life." They exchanged the rings, heavy warm bands forged from pure Caledonian gold. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The Archbishop declared, a warm smile breaking through his formal demeanor. "Your Highness, you may kiss your bride." Arthas didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He pulled Audrey into his arms, dipping her slightly, and kissed her deeply. It was a kiss filled with a year of intense longing, a kiss of absolute triumph, and a promise of profound, enduring love. The massive cathedral erupted into thunderous, joyous applause that shook the stained glass windows. As they turned to face the congregation, fingers tightly laced together, the great bells of St. Clement's began to ring out. It was a glorious, deafening sound that carried across the entire country, signaling a new era. They walked back down the aisle together, the heavy bronze doors opening to the brilliant sunshine of the palace balcony. As they stepped out, the roar of the hundreds of thousands of citizens waiting below hit them like a physical wave. Audrey looked out over the boundless sea of cheering people, the flags snapping in the wind, and then looked up at her husband, who was watching her with absolute adoration. She had once believed her life was entirely over, meticulously destroyed on an altar of public humiliation. But she had learned the hardest lesson of all: sometimes the violent destruction of an illusion is the only way to clear the ground to build a real, unshakable empire. She was no longer just the fragile darling of high society. She was Audrey Kingsley, Crown Princess of Caledonia, a woman beautifully forged in fire, standing fiercely beside a king who loved her entirely for her strength. And as the Caledonian Air Force roared overhead in perfect formation, trailing vibrant blue and gold smoke across the cloudless sky, Audrey smiled, knowing with absolute certainty that her true, magnificent story had only just begun. What a spectacular journey from utter heartbreak to absolute triumph. Audrey's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes what feels like the end of your life is actually the universe clearing the path for the beautiful destiny you truly deserve. Harrison's arrogance was his own downfall, and Arthas proved that real kings recognize the worth of a strong woman. Did you love this story of revenge, resilience, and royal romance? Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who love a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more epic real-life drama stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss out.